Before we get to John Dewey, let me just round out what we were saying about American pragmatism generally and William James in particular. We were seeing some similarities between Whitehead's process philosophy and James's kind of pragmatism. We'll find more still in John Dewey. But similarities because of their rejection of Descartes and foundationalism, because of their concern for the primacy of concrete experience rather than some artificial abstract view of what experience is, such as you find in John Locke. The organic model where individual events are all interrelated into one whole process. Those things in common, I think, between pragmatism and Whitehead. The big difference between the two traditions is the methodological naturalism of the pragmatists, begun by Charles Sanders Peirce. You remember the handout and his conception of the fixation of belief, but pretty explicit as well in William James when he talks of pragmatism as a method of settling philosophical disputes. How? Oh, essentially by checking the empirical consequences of a theory. Do they occur? It's a validation by experimental confirmation of a hypothesis, which is the notion of scientific method that Peirce had. So James is bringing that into philosophy. It means then that philosophy is going to be limited to what has significance for concrete experience, for what has practical consequences. And James had a book, published a book under the title Radical Empiricism. Radical empiricism. The point being that John Locke wasn't radical enough. And in radical empiricism, he operates, you see, with a pragmatic theory of meaning. The only meaningful disputes are those which have practical consequences. Pragmatic theory of meaning. And so he refuses to discuss any issue related to substratum or substance, mind, substance, matter, substance, so forth. It's unrelated to experience, makes no difference. Similarly, he refuses to get into debates over metaphysical monism versus metaphysical pluralism, materialism versus idealism. And you begin to wonder if the whole theoretical, the whole range of theoretical issues in philosophy is being abandoned. Well, it's this sort of thing, that radical empiricism, theory of meaning, which I think underlay the comment I mentioned to you last time from one of my graduate professors introducing a seminar, who said that to his mind, pragmatism and positivism both amount to the same thing and both of them are dead-end streets. Because they both have a theory of meaning, the pragmatic theory of meaning, and then the positivist theory of meaning that we'll be seeing later, which restrict what is mentally significant, cognitively significant, to what has certain kinds of empirical consequences of a verifiable sort, you see. And here in James, it's radical pragmatism. In the positivists, it's what Ayer called the elimination of metaphysics. You'll read Ayer's chapter by that title when we get into positivism. So James then has that note. This tendency to look for empirical consequences, to verify by empirical consequences, comes out in an essay of his called The Will to Believe. The Will to Believe, which you're likely to read in Philosophy of Religion, for instance. What James is doing is responding to a piece by an earlier writer, W.K. Clifford, a piece called The Ethics of Belief, in which Clifford argued that if there is not a weight of evidence for one view rather than another, a weight of argument, then it's morally irresponsible to make a decision. You should withhold judgment. There's the old evidentialist line of John Locke, you see. You have to proportion your belief to the evidence. And if there is no greater degree of evidence for one than another that's significant, then you withhold assent. William James responded in his work on the will to belief that withholding assent isn't always possible. There are some momentous options, choices, that are forced on us in the realities of life. Concrete experience. You see. So in the absence of that evidentialist demand, how are you going to decide? You see. And his point is that you ask yourself in terms of the consequences of the two beliefs for concrete experience, which for James, with his psychological background, means for your psychological well-being. Yes. So that if one belief promises more for you psychologically than the other, then that is sufficient grounds for exercising the will to believe. You see, the voluntary assent. That essay has stood as one of the classic repudiations of the evidentialist demand of John Locke. You see. The other is, I think, the thing coming out of the Scottish realist influence on contemporaries of ours like Alvin Plantinga, who says to the evidentialist demand, I don't see any reason to believe that. In other words, where's the evidence for the evidentialist demand? You see. Because he's trying to say there are certain beliefs which come so naturally, spontaneously, we really have no choice about withholding belief. So William James, in that piece, you see his method at work. He has another essay in which he talks of tough and tender-minded philosophers. Psychological differences, you see. So that if the payoff, the cash value of a concrete experience, psychological, and so he thinks that tough-minded philosophers will believe some things. They'll buy into empiricism, so on and so forth, determinism, and so forth. Tender-minded philosophers will believe other things. You see. The more whole personal context of belief. Now, while that sounds as if it's pretty relativistic, you see, The fact is, if you're looking at the psychology of belief, the nature of a personality does affect it. You know, I wonder if Kant's massive critique that some of you have fallen in love with could ever have been written by California hippie. You see, that was the work of a Prussian bachelor whose life was so organized that the neighbors set their clocks by when he walked down the street to his university. And the laid-back California lifestyle would hardly produce that sort of a work. Well, those of you who take the Kant seminar next year with my friend Stu Hackett will see similarities between his type of psychological makeup and the critique of pure reason. I mean, dear Stu, he's so organized, utterly, meticulously. When he went to India to study Hindu philosophy some years ago, he almost had a nervous breakdown because they were so disorganized. And the relationship between psychology and personality is a fascinating thing. And of course, if you want to overcome that psychological dependency, obviously you need some more universal points of reference. You want to know what is generic human nature, you see, rather than what is this particular type, you see. Keep in mind that the opposite of relative is universal. And there are many, many factors that influence what a person believes and thinks. Some of them are idiosyncratic, different personality types. Some are cultural. Some are generically human. You see, and to get beyond the relative to the universal, you have to get the generically human. And what comports, what comes naturally, but the generically human. Which I take it is the sort of thing that Augustine was doing when he says about the heart being restless until, you see, he thinks that's generically human. Well, you will find similarities between that sort of thing and existentialism, some sorts of existentialism as well. The primacy of the practical, you see, involves human subjectivity, the whole person, our inwardness, as well as the consideration of objective factors. And in James particularly, that's evident. Maybe that's enough about James to illustrate what he's doing. Any comments, or are we ready for the big D? Dewey. Okay. Dewey sounds fairly recent when I say he was born in 1859 and died in 1952. I think he's the first one of whom we've come past mid-century, 1952.